Welcome back to Ask the Trade Pros, a show where a couple trade guys talk about trade stuff. We're here to answer all your questions about your HVAC, electrical, and plumbing needs so you can keep your home running smoothly. I'm Todd.
And I'm Jordan. Our home electric systems are something that we are relying on every day, and even more so as we continue to electrify our house and move away from gas. But most people know shockingly little about how these systems work on their home.
While we don't recommend digging into your home's electrical system armed with pliers and false confidence, there are some things you should know regarding the basics of how certain components work, as well as how to know if there's a problem.
So today we're going to cover the basics about your electric service panel, what it is, what it does, what to do if something's wrong, and how to take a look at it.
So let's get straight into it. Electrical 101.
Todd, what is an electric service panel? What does it do?
So an electrical panel, also called a circuit breaker panel, a service panel, there's many names for it. So it is a critical component for your electrical system. What it does is it distributes the power to various circuits through your home or building, whatever it is, and protects the circuits from overloads.
Now, there could be multiple types of panels. You have the exterior. Here in Arizona, we have exterior service panels. I know other places in the country have them in their basements for some reason. We also have sub panels. Those are all types of panels, correct?
They are all types. What you're mainly going to see is a breaker panel. So they're going to have breakers in them. It used to be that they were fuse panels, so they would have different types of blade fuses or glass screw-in fuses. But most commonly today, you're going to see breakers in those panels. I guess for the 101 side of it, the first thing you're going to notice is you're going to know it's your electrical panel. You're going to open it up, and hopefully what you have in that panel, most importantly, is what's called a main breaker. So typically...
Well, let's start at the beginning, because this is a problem all our guys have problems with. How do they open that panel?
Every panel's a little bit different depending on manufacturer, brand. If it's a sub panel, it could have a push latch. If it's interior mount, if it's an exterior panel, it's going to have a few different options, either a spring on the bottom that you push and you pull down on the panel itself, and to unlock it and open it, it could just have a latch. It could just lift straight up and have a arm that you put up to hold it open for you. So depending on the brand and the age, there's many different ways, but
like a child-proof gate.
Yeah, and I would say if you can't figure out how to open your panel, I wouldn't recommend going into the panel if you can't open it. So that main breaker is the most important thing. That's essentially a switch. So we'll talk about all of these breakers as switches. So
how do we identify that breaker?
The main breaker?
Yes, sir.
Typically it should have a sticker that says main breaker or disconnect source or main shut off, something along those lines. Depending on the manufacturer, most of the time on newer panels, they're at the top of the panel. So it's going to be top dead center of that panel, and it should say main breaker and the amperage of what it's rated at. That is your main shut off. So if you flip that, that is going to shut off every circuit going into the house or the building. So typically, if you are a homeowner and you're working on something electrical in your house, I would shut off the main breaker so you know that nothing is live passing beyond that main breaker.
Now, since we're doing 101, Todd, let's talk a little bit about that breaker, because I know as electricians, we deal with them all the time. But when they go flip that breaker, how's that going to go for them?
Good question. Sometimes, depending on the age, that could be hard to flip off. You might have to put some force into it to flip it off, but I've never had an issue. I'm a bigger guy, so I never have a problem flipping those off. But if you're a smaller person, you might have to put a little bit of force into it.
Just expect it to give you a little more resistance than a regular breaker, you're saying?
Yeah, so under that main breaker or in that breaker panel, you're also going to have circuit breakers. So the circuit breaker is, just as I said, you have your main breaker and a circuit breaker. So the circuit breaker is going to be for individual circuits. So you're going to see...
Can you explain what that is, the individual circuit for them? Like what type of circuits are you going to have?
Well, you're going to have circuits going to each bedroom. You're going to have circuits going to your refrigerator. You're going to have circuits going to your laundry room. You're going to have a higher voltage circuit going to your dryer. You're going to have a circuit for your HVAC system. You're going to have many, many circuits in your home. So those circuit breakers are essentially individual switches for each circuit. They protect that circuit circuit by shutting off the flow to electricity if it exceeds a certain value. With that being said, each breaker is rated for a certain amount of amps. Every device that you have on that circuit is rated for a certain amperage. We'll take a dryer, for example. The dryer is going to have a data plate and it's going to say it's rated for 28 amps, let's say. So you're going to have a 30 amp circuit breaker on that panel. If you had a 28 amp dryer and a 20 amp circuit breaker, you're going to have an issue because it's going to continually trip that breaker because it's not rated for that current that's
That's
passing
good
through.
to know. People kind of need to know what each circuit's for and how it's rated. Obviously, if you have questions about this, you're going to want to talk to a pro because they know what circuit ratings are, what wire sizes, all that stuff. It gives them a general idea that they shouldn't have a smaller circuit on some bigger items. Or I know we have this issue with some customers we have where they try to plug in too many things into one of these circuits and they wonder why it keeps tripping.
Yeah, exactly. So also in the panel, so we discussed the main breaker, we discussed the individual circuit breakers. So you're probably wondering, well, what do those circuit breakers clip into or attach to? What those attach to is what's called a bus bar. So the bus bar is what allows the electricity to pass through to each individual circuit breaker.
So if I'm a customer and I just opened up my service panel, I've listened to Todd's wise advice about the main breaker and the circuit breakers and what the different sizes are. What am I looking at? What am I looking for when I open the panel? Say one of my circuits is out, or how do I know if I have a problem? Like, what are the things I'm looking at on these breakers and devices in the panel?
So depending on what problem you're having and why you're looking in your circuit breaker panel to begin with is a question that we're unaware of at the point. But let's just say that your lights in your bedroom went off or outlets aren't working. So you're going to go to that panel and open your panel, and you're going to be looking for something that's more than likely tripped.
What if I don't see something tripped?
If you don't see something tripped, then what you could do is just individually go, and if your panel's not labeled or if it's labeled incorrectly, you can go through and cycle off and on each breaker to see if that fixes the problem. But a trip breaker tends to be in the middle position. So you'll see all your breakers in the on position are going to be facing over to the left and on one side, depending on which side of the panel it's on. So if they're all look pretty consistent in the way they're positioned, if you have one that's tripped, it's going to pop the little switch, as we're going to call it, goes into the center position, which means tripped. So if that is tripped, then you flip it all the way to the off position prior to cycling it back on. If you just push that breaker, try to push it back to the on position, it's not going to reset. You have to push it to the off position first to reset it and then flip it back on.
That's good advice. We get a lot of customers that call up. They try to turn it from the trip position to the on, and they just say the breaker's bad or it doesn't work. And we've gone out to multiple houses and we were like, well, you've got to turn it all the way off before you go on, and then it holds. The other thing I've seen a lot on those breakers when you're talking about tripping is they don't look like they're tripped. They're just move a fraction off the point. So if you suspect that circuit's tripped, I would say just reset it all the way to the off and on. Sometimes the visual inspection's not enough. So what else are they looking for in the panel? What other kind of things are they looking for? I tend to look, I see rust on the panel, if you got wear on the panel. One of the problems we have out here where we have a lot of panels that are discontinued or no longer available. They're either models like Federal Pacific that have lost their UL rating and should be replaced because they're considered fire hazards, or they're just brands that are out of date and you can't get the breaker anymore. They have weird sizes, weird locks. As Todd was talking about a little earlier, they connect into that bus bar, and you can't just put any breaker in any box. It has to be the right breaker for that box or it won't connect to that bar correctly, and then you'll have a fire hazard.
Yeah, so you touched on corrosion or rust. If you open that panel and you see anything that's rusted, that's probably a sign of a leak at the panel. Or if you see moisture in there, that's never a good thing for electrical.
You don't like water and electricity, Todd? I mean, for coffee, instead of coffee, just touch it.
Yeah, I personally don't like it. I wouldn't recommend putting your hands in that panel if it is wet either. Won't be a good thing to happen.
No, we want our listeners to stay around.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, signs of rust or corrosion, I would probably recommend calling your local trade pro to get some advice on what to do with that. And it is also good to regularly inspect your panel and look for signs of wear, overheating. A lot of times.
So tell me a little bit what a sign of overheat. I know we're electricians, right, Todd? So you say sign of overheating, but what does that look like to a consumer that's never looked at a breaker or a panel?
When stuff in our homes age and start drawing more electricity or loose connections, it can cause resistance and cause overheating. So typically what you're going to see is discoloration. Typically a bus bar is going to be, a silver color. So if you're looking at
this bus bar, though, remember, they have to take the panel, not just the door of the panel off, they have to take the secondary panel to see the bus bar.
Yes, you have to take
usually connected by two screws or
one screw, depending on the brand.
Some houses we see in there, nothing. They're just sitting in there.
Yeah, some houses just, they pull right out. But yeah, once you remove that panel and inspect the wires, you're going to notice, you're going to look at all the connections and see if you see discoloration or oxidation. It's going to be a bronze looking color instead of silver. Could be black. Hopefully you don't open it and see black in the panel, but that's all going to be signs of overheating or damage. Again, if you do see that, call somebody who's licensed, bonded, insured, and have them come out and give you an inspection. Another thing to be aware of in a panel as well is what we call double tapping breakers. Double tapping can be very dangerous. So what that means is
it's technically a violation of any code that we've ever seen too, right?
It is a code violation, yes, but that doesn't stop people from doing it. They're just looking to get power, and that's all.
Can't plug an unlimited amount of things into the panel.
That's all that matters at the time for them, right? But yes, double tapping is a big thing, and like we talked about earlier, the circuit breaker is designed for one circuit, which means that exiting that circuit breaker should be one wire. So if you're seeing two wires coming out of a breaker, that is what's called a double tap. Now remember that we talked about the breakers in different amperages of the breaker. So you have a 15 amp breaker, a single pole breaker, that's designed for one circuit for 15 amps. Now, if you tie another circuit into that, you're essentially tying in two 15 amp circuits to one breaker, which could potentially be problems.
Yeah, these double taps Todd's talking about, anytime you put too much electricity through the wrong wire, it heats up, and heat means fire, and fire means burning the house down. So we strongly recommend that you be aware whether you have double taps. Don't do double taps. Make sure these breakers are one line per breaker, because that's exactly how they're sized. Let's talk a little bit more about other things to do with the panel. What we've seen a lot of lately, and we recommend it for any panel that can handle it, is if you put a whole home surge suppressor on that panel. We put them on our regular devices now. Everybody has a computer, everybody has a smart TV, etc. You might put that on a surge suppressor. Well, what do you do for the appliances in your house? Every washing machine has a control board now. Every fridge has a control board now. So we always recommend, if your panel has room for it, you put a whole home surge suppressor on it. You'll know if you have one of these on the panel. Sometimes they're inside the panel, depending on how your panel's sunk, but usually they stick out from the panel. A small box, oftentimes with a light. Generally, the light will tell you whether it's working or not. Very straightforward device, but a very useful device to have that you might also notice sticking out from this box. Todd, what else would people see when they open their panel or look at their panel? What might they expect to see? I know we see all kinds of variety. It doesn't make us nervous, but people have asked the questions, when they see random things sticking out of the panel or how the box looks.
Yeah, so depending on the age of the panel, we talked about the front cover that's going to cover the wiring and circuitry in that panel. On a lot of these older homes and people doing work over the years, sometimes you'll see a space that appears that it's not filled, meaning missing a breaker. Those should have a cover placed in those. So if you have a child or children in the neighborhood, kids like to play around with stuff, you don't want to put your finger in there because you're going to know it if you do.
Yeah, and you'll get moisture and other stuff in there too. Those are relatively simple pieces to get that snap in there, right, Todd?
Yeah, they're fairly inexpensive and you can buy them based off of brands. So Square D makes one that fits their panel, Eaton makes one that fits their panel, etc.
One of the other things I've seen, we're talking about older panels. I don't see it as much on the newer homes, but on some of the older panels have what they are called knockouts. They're little circles where you're supposed to punch a hole, and should you connect an EMT or circuit wiring or a branch up to it, you knock these things out, and that's how you run the wire into them. I've seen a lot of old panels that are missing knockouts. They have a hole in them, and as Todd talked about earlier, unless you're into it, you don't really want want water getting in your electrical panel. That's a recipe for fire, a recipe for short, recipe for melting. So you're going to also want to take a look at a panel. And if you see a hole on this panel that's exposed to the outside, you're going to want to have a cover for it.
So I think for a lot of that, we covered Electrical 101, then Jordan jumped right into Electrical
102? Just asking them what they'll see on their panel, like we're trying to give them some advice here, right? Like make sure they recognize what they see and don't freak out that some flashing light is on the side of the box.
Yeah, so if you do experience consistent trips, burning smells, unusual sounds from the panel, or if you need to upgrade your system,
if your panel's sizzling, it is not making bacon.
It is not making bacon. And I would say it's best to contact a licensed electrician at that time.
Yes, we've seen them catch on fire, hum. Yeah, don't mess around with electricity, right, Doc?
Exactly. Thank you for joining us today at Ask the Trade Pros. If you enjoyed the show and want to check out upcoming episodes, be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform.
If you have a question about your home, we probably have an answer, but we definitely have something to say about it. Send us a message and we may feature your question in a future episode. The information on how to contact us is located in our show notes.
Thank you to Done Right Services, as always, for sponsoring this podcast and supporting our show.